Oscar, let's start with you, because obviously the most, well, one of the most dramatic events of the last few months has been the attempted coup in Turkey. Tell us, how does it look from your position? How do things look from Ankara, and how does this affect the rest of us? So over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Before coming to the coup attempt in Turkey, actually there are other important developments that have been taken in Turkey for the last, there are always interesting developments in Turkey, but particularly during the last 2 years or 1.5 years. A month ago I was speaking at another event in Berlin, and then I prepared a list of, and I wish I had brought that list with me, outstanding incidents that have happened in Turkey during the last 18 months. And what did I add here? Important political developments like elections, collapse of a government, terrorist attacks with casualties of more than 5 people. If 3 people died, I didn't even include it in the list, and obviously then the coup attempt. And I had like 50 entries. Okay? Like terrorist attacks where 100 people died, 50 people died, 20 people died. In Turkey now, if 7 people die in a terrorist attack, it's in the 3rd page, not the headlines. So Turkey has been in such a situation for a long time, even before the coup attempt. And why is that so? Is it only particular to Turkey, or are there other reasons? Turks love mentioning Turkey's place on the map because that creates lots of excuses for us. But it's also true. Look at most of the frozen conflicts in the world. We say, they are all in our region, the Black Sea, Caspian, and the Balkan region, but they are also in close proximity to Turkey. Well, look at the Middle East. We are mentioning Syria, and Turkey has a very long land border with Syria. Very soon there will be an operation in Iraq to liberate, according to us, Mosul from Daesh, and that is very close to Turkey. We talk about sanctions to Iran, Iranian nuclear deal, etc. That's very close to Turkey. Actually, the whole regional order in the Middle East is collapsing, and on Turkey's borders. Well, we have mentioned Yugoslavia and the Balkans, and that's also very close to Turkey. So Turkey is in the middle of this volatile region, and in such a situation, it is very difficult to keep Turkey stable. So what you see in Turkey for a very large part is unfortunately also very difficult to prevent. Now, if we come to the coup attempt, it sounds, when I tell foreigners about what happened, I see people, smiling at me, disbelieving me, because it sounds so surrealistic, actually. A religious cult infiltrating the Turkish state for over 30 years, capturing 50% of the positions in the police force, 40% of the positions in the military, getting control of the judiciary, etc., and then attempting a coup d'etat. Now, it sounds very surreal, but I can tell you it's also very much real. Its roots actually go back to the coup d'etat in Turkey in 1980, when the Turkish deep state decided to wipe off the Turkish left in defense from communism, and they decided that moderate Islamism would be the antidote to both communism and radical Islam. So they actually they supported and fed this religious network, which was very small and feeble at that time, and this religious network actually changed faces during every political era in Turkey. If there was a coup d'etat, suddenly they became nationalists. If there is a more liberal government, they suddenly became liberals. They changed faces during every era, and they made sure that their people would be appointed to important positions in the Turkish state. What was their agenda? What did they attempt to do? Why did they attempt a coup d'etat? Was it their eventual goal to gain total control of the Turkish state via a coup d'etat? No, actually a coup d'etat wasn't their plan A or B or C. It was the last thing that they could do before they lost all of their power. And what was their goal? It was to create a bureaucratic oligarchy in Turkey. And I think this is the more relevant part of what's going on in Turkey. Because in a country like Turkey, and there are other countries in the region like Turkey in this sense, which is highly centralistic, which is highly state-centric, which has a political game where the winner takes it all. So actually, if you control the government, you control all economy, you control all media, you control the civil society, you control academia, and you have the say on who we are. Then it matters to control the country. I mean, why is it very unlikely that there will be a coup d'etat in the United States? Because in the United States, if you control Washington and maybe a little bit more, but you don't control the United States. Because it's decentralized, because there are checks and balances, because actually the winner doesn't take it all there. Okay? But because Turkey was and is a highly centralized regime, then it's important to control the government. And that's what they aim to do. And fortunately, they could not succeed because of the resolve of the government, the bravery of the Turkish people, etc., etc. But the aftermath is actually what an author who wrote for GMF said is saving democracy through non-democratic means. So yes, of course, a coup attempt has no place in a democracy, right? It's an attack to democracy. But the defense of a democracy should be with democratic means. Otherwise, actually, the means is the end. So what you're doing becomes what you aim. So right now, what we see in Turkey is under serious panic. And I mean, this panic is not unfounded, okay? There are legitimate reasons to be panicking in Turkey right now. But right now, the government, and not even the government, I mean, now there is a counter-Gülenist move in Turkey, which is gaining its own momentum, which I believe even the government is now losing control of. People who are directly, indirectly, or vaguely limited to this cult are now being put under suspicion. If they are civil servants, they are being suspended from their jobs. If they are working in private sector, their employees are asked to unemploy them, and they cannot find new jobs. And if they are seriously close to the management, close to the leadership of the organization, they might find themselves in prison. Look, I'm totally honest. I'm totally innocent. I have nothing to do with this group, and I have no sympathy. And now that they are not strong anymore, I'm actually free to declare that I dislike them. But even I, when coming here, was worried that maybe my passport is cancelled and I would be unable to leave Turkey. So I actually spoke to someone who is very close to the government, who came here. And he is innocent, and he is very close to the government, and he had the same concern. What if they have cancelled my passport? This is the psychology that we are living in Turkey right now. And if you on a personal note, I love the Istiklal Street in Istanbul. I mean, I live in Ankara, so whenever I go to Istanbul, I love to go to the Istiklal Street, but I don't go there anymore because either ISIL or the PKK could actually explode a bomb that could cost my life. People, when you go to the airport, you feel nervous. Something could happen because Turkey is not under attack only, from one organization, this organization or that organization, but Turkey is actually right now under attack from multiple sources and is trying to cope with all of them. Is trying to do, the best job we can, but I must say that the result doesn't look very bright. Let me stop here for now.
I mean, I'm going to ask, don't put it down, I'm going to ask you if you can sum up, but very briefly, I'm going to ask you, look at your crystal ball and tell us in 6 months, or if we're back here in a year, how do you think things will look in a year, both for Turkey, but I'm going to ask you then selfishly for the rest of us. What does this mean for the rest of us? In Europe, but first of all, but in the West in general?
Okay, I mean, I can say with 100% confidence that the rule of emergency will continue in Turkey. So, which means that the country will be ruled by government decrees that are not subject to constitutional checks and balances. First of all, power consolidation by the government and the president will continue. So you will see a Turkey where power is even more concentrated than today. So there will be more let's say, that there will be more control of one person over the country. And what does this mean for everyone else? Well, Turkey will increasingly look like those countries where if you want to make a deal, you make the deal with one person. And actually, that person's decision, because that's a human being, decision or opinion could change from day to day. Like if you're negotiating with the US president, you are not negotiating with the US president, you are negotiating with an institution. And institutions, the positions of institutions don't change from one day to the other. But in cases like this, actually, you're negotiating with someone who could change his mind a week later. So increasingly Turkey will look like that. Any relationship with Turkey will need to be transactional. So it's very difficult to have strategic relationship with Turkey. For anyone, it will be increasingly transactional. I mean, the relationship between Turkey and the EU is already transactional. It's the latest refugee deal shows, and the relationship between Turkey and the United States, which once was a strategic relationship, is also transactional, and the transaction cost is very high for both sides.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions for you later on. Okay, we're now going to pass to Levent Benko, Deputy Secretary of State for Security Policy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade from Hungary. I can't remember the exact date that Budapest fell to the Ottomans, 14-something, but I do remember
August 29.
Sorry?
August 29.
What year? What was the year?
1541.
In 1541. But when it fell, then sure, but the transactions are still going up and down, because what I was going to say was that the famous library of the Hungarian King Mátyás Corvinus was then shipped down the Danube by boat and back to Istanbul, and then Firmans and all sorts of sort of rules and regulations came back up the Danube. So in a way, we can say that one thing has changed. It's not just sort of Firmans and books going up and down the Danube, but okay, by road now we've had migrants. So in that sense, Istanbul and Budapest, or Turkey and Hungary, there very much is a nexus, a relationship here. So, and of course affecting political life, as we've seen very much so in the last week or so with the referendum, and Orban becoming a kind of a politician whom some people in Europe and some people in Europe hate. I mean, there doesn't seem to be much of a kind of middle ground here. Anyway, so how does it look from Budapest?
Sure, quite a wide topic to cover in 5 minutes, but may I start with maybe Turkey and go on to the Western Balkans, because this is also the region in between Turkey and Hungary, Turkey and Central Europe, which is also suffering from the migration crisis. And I'd like to end up with talking about the enlargement policy of the Euro-Atlantic community, which we see is waning in a way which leads to a plethora of problems for both the EU and NATO and for these countries. Of course, there's lots of speak about solidarity these days, and I must stress also as a representative of the Hungarian government that we fully understand, of course, the position of our Turkish friends in Turkey, and of course the situation is extremely complicated. Turkish society is also facing a serious upheaval in the past couple of weeks and months. But I wish to point out that exactly for the reasons that my colleague just mentioned, Hungary is at full solidarity with Turkey after the attempted coup d'etat. This was an extremely serious thing. Unfortunately, not all international actors came out loud and clear in the immediate days following the coup d'etat, and that gave some reason and foundation for resentment on the Turkish side. Our position is that Turkey is a key factor of stability in an extremely sensitive geopolitical area, Turkey is a key player in the Middle East, in the Caucasus, in the Western Balkans, because of the refugee deal. As Özgür mentioned, it's also a key partner for the European Union. And in that respect, the stability of Turkey is of paramount importance for us. Now onto the Western Balkans, and I will come to migration in the end. It's been an underlying thought in Hungarian foreign policy that enlargement is and has been the strongest conveyor of the soft power of the Euro-Atlantic community of values outside its own area. And this conveyor achieved extreme successes in the 1990s and early 2000s, with, of course, the integration of Central and Eastern Europe, in NATO and then in the European Union. The Euro-Atlantic community scored enormous successes in stabilizing the Western Balkans. And I would also touch upon a little bit Europe's eastern neighborhood, because the Eastern Partnership Program heralded a potential new beginning for the countries of the post-Soviet space. The backbone of these successes has been that both the EU and NATO provided a credible perspective of economic and political integration for these countries, and the problems stem from the fact these years, we believe, is that this conveyor belt is losing traction. There's a credibility gap which is opening, more for the EU, less for NATO. I will come back to this a little bit later on. And for that reason, the Euro-Atlantic area is waning, its influence is waning, also in the Western Balkans, but also in the East. Let me cite a couple of examples. First, in the East. The Eastern Partnership Program, heralded in 2009, a highly successful program at the beginning, is now losing momentum. The implementation of the association agreement with Ukraine is in a limbo. The ratification process is in a limbo. We, the EU, promised visa-free travel for Georgians and Ukrainians. Both countries fulfilled all the benchmarks. Technically, they are ready. But this issue is caught up in a completely unrelated tug of war, by the way, on the EU-Turkey deal. And therefore, the publics of these countries are highly disappointed, which of course means that the traction and the soft power of the EU is also waning in these countries. To sum it up, we offered these countries an alternative, and now we are failing to deliver on that. And of course, others are also, third players are also aware of all this. On the Western Balkans, instead of accelerating the integration process in the face of the multitude of challenges, we see that the integration process is also slowing down. Hungary was less than happy when the representatives of the current European Commission stated loud and clear that there is going to be no enlargement during the tenure of this European Commission, which of course may be a statement of fact, but in terms of political communication and especially strategic communication, we believe it is an enormous mistake. It automatically creates, or has created maybe already, a vacuum that could be filled by others. That is why we were thrilled to see, and we worked really hard on inviting Montenegro to NATO at the NATO Foreign Ministerial back last May. It happened in a crucial moment. It sent a very important message that the open door policy of NATO is not over, and the enlargement is not over, and the alliance cannot be deterred from adopting new members if they want to be members. And of course, this is to be continued. We must proceed with Macedonia. We must give perspective to Georgia as well, despite the well-known troubles these countries are facing. Hungary is strongly committed to the stability of the Western Balkans. So we have a wide operational presence in KFOR and in EU4 in Kosovo and Bosnia. We are giving advice and strong political support in the EU for all these countries. I don't want to single them out one by one. And why we are doing this? Because the Western Balkans is unfinished business. First, of course, on top of the list is the traditional ethno-nationalist sentiment that is still alive and well. If we look at the rhetoric recently in Bosnia and Herzegovina and some other countries, this is clear. There's also a fear of radicalization in the Western Balkans. The number we know of foreign fighters who left for Syria is in the hundreds in the Western Balkans. So this is not a problem to be ignored. And third, the Western Balkans, and I come to the conclusion in that regard, has been a de facto buffer for the stream of migrants entering Europe just last year. In fact, the Western Balkans countries should be natural partners for the European Union for these reasons, but they do not feel the solidarity coming from the EU. We are trying to help them as the way we can, dispatching dozens of policemen and assisting them in border control. Indeed, we, since you asked about the referendum a couple of days ago, indeed, this is, in a way, we see it as a referenda in general, as an alternate form of obtaining democratic legitimacy in democracies, in liberal democracies. The subject basically was on whether mandatory quotas could be imposed on national legislation in the future. It's also, we are not hiding the fact that this referendum is also in close connection with the self-reflection which is underway within the European Union on the loss of democratic legitimacy, which is a general phenomenon, I think, in many EU member states. Making a small detour here, we also believe that the referendum on Brexit was not the cause, but rather the consequence of something, and we must explore how we ended up here. And the Hungarian government is indeed trying to go against this current, the loss of democratic legitimacy, and therefore the referendum served its very purpose of involving citizens in this important decision. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. There are so many things there that we could talk for another couple of hours, but I'm going to sort of I'm not going to put anything come back to you now because I want to get as much from all of you as possible. So before we open it up, Andrei Kolesnikov, you're a senior associate and chair of the Russian Domestic Politics and Political Institutions program at Carnegie in Moscow. How does it look from Moscow? Where are we going, and how is it going to affect us all, both in Russia and in Europe and the West in general?
I understand that my added value or simple value is in my origin position in Moscow. I'm living in the center of this perfect storm with sanctions, counter-sanctions, and different initiatives unexpected for everyone. When we are awakening in Moscow, we are waiting for something new from Kremlin. Our panelists, some kind of a logical continuation of the previous panel concerning deterrence and reassurance, moving from reassurance to deterrence. And I understand the logic of deterrence. I understand that politically the West can do only that has been done, and sanctions can be lifted, removed, only toughened maybe But in reality, nobody discusses the consequences for Russian citizens who in reality are under double pressure, in a sense that they have to be under pressure of the West, because all the sanctions, they are against personalities, they are against companies, but the majority of Russians, not everybody, but the majority of Russians, assesses this situation as sanctions against Russia. And it only helps to perceive the image of Putin as a symbol of Russia, not as an average man or politician, but as a person who defends everyone from this total and permanent pressure. In that sense, I can say that here is a question: is there any kind of room for diplomacy? Maybe yes, it was, but very, very small room, and it depends on exclusively on the decisions of Putin himself. While living in a personalistic political system, in reality this is electoral autocracy, and we can take into account the personal views, for example, of Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov. I think that he has his own views, but he is implementing only the will of the sovereign. In that sense, all this Russian political, financial, technocratic elite is under total control. And if we imagine the situation for an average Russian citizen, the mainstream is to support Putin, to support this eclectical patriotic ideology, and this is simply the case of psychology of the mob. If you are inside the mainstream, you can't behave in another way. You must be with your compatriots, you must be patriotic, you must be even nationalistic or imperialistic, and this is such a political culture. And if you are talking in terms of political culture, all this additional pressure from the West will only irritate Putin, and the consequences could be very hard for Russians, for Russian citizens. We must understand that this political culture of tit for tat is deeply rooted in Russia, and our elites will be very irritated if, for example, Ukraine will be in NATO, Georgia will be in NATO. I can't even imagine what will be when, if Sweden or Finland will be in NATO. I don't think so that they will join NATO, but in reality it will be additional factor to be on the swords point with the West. I must pay attention to the moods of the majority in Russia in order to explain the situation, not defending it, but explaining. There was some kind of a social contract between Putin's state and the majority of Russians. I mean, non-involvement in politics for average Russians in exchange for good economic shape, in exchange for foodstuff, possibility to be rich, possibility to join middle class. And it worked in the first 2 or 3 terms of this regime. It depends on how to count the terms of Putin. Now here is another social contract, much more tougher, because this is strong support of this political regime for the majority of Russians in exchange for Crimea and this very feeling of great power, of pride, primarily for the glorious past, and for our triumphant behavior and our victories in present time. If we shall see this so-called rate of approval of the activity of Putin, we can see that it depends on different kinds of conflicts. or warfares, hybrid warfares, hot warfares, cold warfares, and so on. When he was a prime minister and Medvedev was a president, there was a Georgian war intervention. This rating of approval was quite high, but quite modest comparing with current figures. It was 60-something. In September 2008, the rating of Prime Minister Putin was much more higher, 80% something. Then it was quiet time with a lot of discussions about modernization, about gadgets, about the possibility to live normal European-like life under Medvedev. It's very significant, by the way, to have such a quiet atmosphere without any special talks about patriotism and imperialism and so on. And the rating of approval of Putin was 60-something, with some, it was slippery slope for him because the tendency wasn't too good, deteriorating rating. And then it was Olympic Games, and the rating of Putin became much more higher, 70%, nearly 70%. And then, at the end of the day, this main event in post-Soviet history seems to me this annexation of Crimea. Now we have this rating of approval 80-something, and this is one of the most stable sociological indicators in our country, comparable only with the rate of support of the very idea of the annexation of Crimea. Paradoxically, it works until now. Yes, there is no so many emotions around this annexation, but this is a constant factor in Russian politics. All the approval ratings of trust to governmental bodies, they are deteriorating steadily but slowly, just like Russian economy. And the only rating of approval of Putin is stable, like rock in the sea. And we must understand this, that for the majority of Russians, this is nearly the only anchor. This is something symbolic which can show, which can demonstrate to everyone that we are glorious, that we are in reality a former empire, but we can be, just like it was in Soviet Union times, empire again. And in that sense, the Syrian campaign, this is one more sign of our migrants. So this is only explanation of the psychology, political psychology of Russian elites and the majority of Russians. This explaining of this enigma, why so many people are ready to support this regime, are ready to continue to suffer from this economic crisis, not protesting. So I will stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, there's a lot to come back to, but I'm going to go straight over to David Kremer from the McCain Institute in Washington. You must be worrying about Europe. Of course, Europe is worrying about what's about to happen in Washington. But anyway, tell us how it looks from your point of view.
I'm worried about my country too, to be perfectly honest. I think a lot of the problems that we're talking about, not just on this panel, but in the forum as a whole, are attributable in part to U.S. foreign policy and the lack of U.S. leadership. And to show that I can be bipartisan in my criticism, I would go back to two specific issues from the Bush administration days, and I served all 8 years in the Bush administration. The first, of course, was the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, which had enormous influence on President Obama and his thinking on how to approach foreign policy and strategic challenges. The second, one that doesn't get anywhere near as much attention, was the failure to respond with any sanctions or consequences for Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008. You could even go back a year before to the cyber attack by Russia against Estonia in 2007. And I think the failure to have responded to the war in 2008 has contributed to Putin's thinking that he can get away with this kind of behavior, these kinds of actions. And the war in Iraq, of course, has shaped President Obama's view I remember vividly a comment he made to the Washington Post editorial board 5 days before he was sworn in as president in January 2009, in which he said you cannot promote democracy through the barrel of a gun. And this has been an administration, President Obama's administration, that has been the least supportive of advancing freedom, human rights, and democracy going back since Richard Nixon. And the war in Iraq had an impact on his views on democracy promotion. The war in Iraq had an impact on his views toward U.S. military intervention. And what we have seen often is that the president sets up what we call in the U.S. straw man arguments, which is to say he holds up one extreme or another extreme and doesn't recognize that there are gradations in between. So it's either doing nothing or sending in the entire U.S. military to address a certain challenge. Those of us who have argued for a more activist approach in Syria, for example, have never argued that we should send in the entire U.S. military. We had argued for support for what was more clearly identifiable as a moderate Syrian opposition in the first few years of the war, and to create a safe zone, safe haven for IDPs and potential refugees. And the president, in my view, has abdicated the responsibility we have to try to prevent what is going to be the biggest stain on his foreign policy, which is doing anything to prevent the slaughter of nearly 500,000 people in Syria, the displacement of half the population. He did the right thing in Libya in 2011, in my view, but then he failed to do the right follow-up thing. It was right to intervene to prevent the bloodbath in Benghazi, but then we and Europe together washed our hands of Libya, which was an enormous mistake. Libya was a country that lived for over 4 decades under a madman, had no experience with democracy. It was arguably the most pro-American country in the Arab world after the intervention in Benghazi, and we turned our backs on the Libyans, and we now see what has unfolded since then. In the case of Syria, our failure to do anything created a vacuum which Mr. Putin has filled, and done so in one of the most brutal fashions I think we've seen in a long time, though frankly I don't think we should be shocked given the way Putin came to power, which is the war in Chechnya in '99 and several years after, in which similar kinds of force we used against Chechens during that time as we're seeing against Syrians. Which brings me to the challenge of Russia that we face in Ukraine, where, in my view, President Obama has failed to show personal investment and leadership in this issue. I am embarrassed as an American. I don't speak for other Americans or certainly for the administration, but I'm embarrassed as an American that President Obama has not found the time to visit Ukraine as president. He did go there as a senator with Senator Lugar back during the Bush administration days. But his failure to show through simply flying in on Air Force One with the American flag, solidarity and support for Ukraine during its time of greatest need was, I think, a terrible signal to send to Ukrainians, first of all, but perhaps just as importantly to Mr. Putin and the Kremlin. So I wish the president had not delegated responsibility for dealing with the invasion of Ukraine to Chancellor Merkel. I don't criticize Chancellor Merkel. I think she's done as good a job as one could under the circumstances. But I do regret that my president has not been more engaged himself. After all, I think that's what Putin wants, is to at least have that kind of interaction with the American president. He doesn't view that having it with even the German chancellor, as important as she is adequate. So I would not, as I said at the outset, I would not attribute all the world's problems to a lack of U.S. leadership, but I think a lack of U.S. leadership has made a lot of the problems we're facing worse. With our election coming up, I've never seen an election like this in my life. I hope never to see an election like this again in the United States. We're a country of over 320 million people, and I wish we could have found 2 better candidates than the ones we have. I'm a Republican. I have signed open letters saying Donald Trump is unfit to be president of the United States. Those were the easiest letters I've ever signed. And yet I can't bring myself, I'm probably going to vote for Hillary Clinton, but I can't bring myself to endorse her for all of the baggage that she has herself. She obviously would be a safer choice. She would be a better choice. But, and I'll end with this, I wouldn't be surprised if she were to win. And by the way, you shouldn't automatically assume she's going to win. Given some of the outcomes of referenda we've seen in the world, voters can do strange things when it's their turn to go and cast their ballots. President Santos thought he was going to win the referendum in Colombia, and that didn't go too well. Cameron thought he'd win the Brexit vote, that didn't go too well. But if Secretary Clinton were to win and become president, I could easily imagine that Mr. Putin will have a few surprises up his sleeves for her early on to test her. So we also have to start thinking about those contingencies too. Sorry to depress the hell out of you.
Yes, that's gloom all round. Thank you for Anchorage to Washington, gloom all round. Well, fine. Well, let's just open this up, and whoever wants to talk, whoever wants to make a comment or a question, to be short and snappy, and to tell us who you are. First person.
I have one question because it's been touched upon this issue during the day. And I'm glad that we have an American, the EU, and somebody from Russia to comment upon an issue that needs to be addressed in some way, whether we like it or not. And that is the future of the future security architecture in Europe. And whether we like it or not, my personal opinion is that Russia has a role has a say in this. How would you feel about this, considering also the Brexit debate and all the implications behind for the European security infrastructure in the future? You, Tim, are very acquainted with what happens in the UK from this point of view. And although the debate is still very at the beginning, and maybe people are not realizing what's happening and what are the consequences for both the UK and the EU in terms of what will happen to the future of Britain, whether in NATO or in the EU. I would be interested in having your perspectives and from Mr. Kolesnikov as well. Thank you.
Great. You should tell everyone who you are.
Sorry. Agnes Nicolas, Aspen Institute, Romania.
Okay. Who wants to be next?
Or not.
Oh, yes, okay.
I'm Helen and I'm a lecturer in the Bucharest School of Governance. I have a question for you, Mr. Kramer. You said that if Hillary Clinton would win, then you said Mr. Putin would have something for her in her sleeve. What if Trump wins? What would be then the scenario that Mr. Putin can put in place? Thank you.
I have a question to Andrei Kolesnikov. What should have done differently after Georgia, after Ukraine, after some other things, what we see in the eastern Ukraine? So what should have done differently?
We have existing European security architectures. We should make them work. Russia is a member of the OSCE. One of the baskets of the OSCE is security. Russia's efforts, particularly under the Putin regime, especially under the Putin regime, have been to undermine the OSCE, particularly the human dimension basket. But even the security basket, with vetoes of designees to run OSCE missions in various territories and states. So I'm more interested in getting what we have working effectively than in looking for new security architectures that would likely give Russia more say and veto over new arrangements. The whole EASY project, the European Security Initiative, I think it was called, it's a terrible idea in my view. And I hope that we stop pursuing these elusive security architectures and focus more on concentrating our efforts to make what we have work. NATO has been, it's been said, particularly in the context of the US election with Donald Trump's comments about NATO. NATO's been the most successful military alliance in history, arguably. And I do think NATO has refound its mission, which is to protect existing member states from threats. And as was said in an earlier panel, an open door policy is exactly the right thing. We did in 2008 say that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. We should not close that door. And it's often the path toward membership that's the most painful. Rwandans can attest to this better than I can. Hungary too. It's the path toward membership that's the most painful. Once you get membership, you don't become complacent, but it is a much better feeling to have hard guarantees.
Just there was one question directly to you about Trump.
What would Putin have up his sleeve for Hillary Clinton? I'm worried what Trump has up his sleeve, quite frankly. The problem with, what Trump has said about Putin is deeply troubling. It reflects either willful ignorance on his part about what kind of leader Putin is, or some more nefarious motives, whether it's investment interests or something else. The advisors that Trump has announced seem to have major conflicts of interest, including Carter Page, who had investments apparently in Gazprom, Mike Flynn, who was paid to speak at RT's 10th anniversary conference last December, and others whom I've never heard of, frankly. Mike Pence in the vice presidential debate, I was on the plane ride coming here, so I didn't see it, but caught some glimpses of what he had to say. It was much tougher on Putin than the #1 on that ticket. So, and this is one of the problems with Trump. Uzgar was saying we don't have to worry about coups and things in the United States. I deeply worry about Donald Trump as president of the United States. Our system is based on rule of law, but also, just as important, acceptance of decisions that other institutions make. Supreme Court, Congress. What if Donald Trump says, to hell with the Supreme Court, or I'm going to ignore what the Congress says? That's a test I don't want our country to face. And he is so unpredictable, so crazy, that I wouldn't rule anything out. And last thing I'd say, following our region that we're talking about here, I've become familiar with cults of personality. That's what Trump reminds me of. There's no platform, there's no strategy, there's no policy. It's Donald Trump, it's a cult of personality. And boy, I don't want that in my country.
Okay, sorry, Andrzej, but Levin wanted to pick up on this, and then I'm going to come to you. Please.
Yeah, just very briefly on the security architecture question. Obviously, with the annexation of Crimea, the European security architecture suffered a major blow. But I tend to agree with Mr. Kramer that we have the existing structures in place through the OSCE. We have the existing framework for confidence building, for risk reduction, on SNAP exercises, on all these issues, CFE treaty, Vienna document. A lot of things institutionally have been built up in the past 25 years, I would say, since Helsinki even, in the past 40 years. So that should be filled with content and in terms of confidence building. But let me also point out that Hungary also being a NATO ally, NATO being the most successful military and political alliance in history, and just a couple of months ago we concluded a summit in Warsaw, which decided on deterrence and dialogue at the same time. Deterrence on the eastern flank with the enhanced forward presence and with reassurance measures, to which Hungary is also contributing. But at the same time making clear that the channel of dialogue with Russia is open. And through the NATO-Russia Council, at least we are giving the impression that we are not closing ourselves off to dialogue. And third, last, on open door policy, I can just repeat what I previously said. One of the guarantees for NATO's continued success is acting on open door policy. Empty promises in this regard are not enough anymore. Thank you.
Andrzej, do you want to pick up that?
Yes, I can sum up answer to questions which are quite close to each other. I can say it's too late to involve Putin in some systems of security or something like that. And I was very skeptical when my colleagues said in the beginning of the Syrian campaign that this is the space for cooperation with the United States. It seemed to me that this is a field for new confrontation, because Putin is ready to construct any systems only on his own terms right now. And it was late, maybe not even after his annexation of Crimea. It could be in time only in the beginning of his first term, when he wanted to be the world leader in a normal sense of the word. But now he is this world leader, and everybody in the West says that he's a strong man, that he's the strongest in the world, and the Russian army is very strong, and so on, so on. This is also mythology, and mythology supported by the West as well, not only inside Russia. Right now, this regime needs permanent conflicts in order to maintain support, in order to maintain the permanent mobilization of quite different people. Russians do not differ in a high extent from any other nation, but for the moment they want to be with their commander being inside the besieged fortress, feeling the permanent pressure from the West and so on. And by the way, because of all this stuff, Putin announced this pivot to the east, to China, to Japan. Here is a very sophisticated game between China and Japan right now, different diplomatic efforts and so on. So this is his new game, trying to construct some kind of quasi-empire, apart from Baltic states and Moldova, something like that, but trying to begin this gamble with Central Asia and so on and so on. They can't understand that in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, they are trying to implement multi-vector policy. They're not ready to be the promises of a new empire. So it was too late, and what is concerning, especially this story with Georgia and Ukraine, this is different stories, because when it was Georgia, it was some space for diplomatic force in order to involve Medvedev's Russia in European structures. Medvedev was ready for it, but he was not ready to be the president twice. It was a real problem for the West. So Putin and his elites, they were frightened by primarily Arab Spring and then by Maidan. Just like Brezhnev was frightened by Prague in 1968 to the same extent. And this is the reason for defending Assad. When one top person in our hierarchy is awakening in the morning, I think he sees in the mirror the face of Assad, and this is one more reason to make some efforts to defend him in these distanced territories, 1,000 kilometers from Russian borders.
Oscar, do you want to make a comment on any of those things? No? Okay, well actually, I realise we've kind of run out of time, but I think I'm going to ask for like one more question. Has anyone got one more question? If not, I'm going to wrap it up, because we actually have finished our...
Just a small,
okay, please,
there
just
no
one more
other
question. Yeah, no more.
Just a small addition
to the microphone.
To my comment. Yeah, I think I'll just speak up. Just to get back on the issue. Obviously, what we see now between Russia and NATO in terms of public policy interactions and the dialogue existing on deterrence, whether it's security, deterrence, or forward posture and all the concepts related, is obviously not functioning. And what we see for the last 2 years since the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of, or rather the intervention in eastern Ukraine, is just a circle of speeches and, of course, declarative intentions that we would like to see a stabilized security environment in Eastern Europe. However, things are not moving forward. That's why there is this concept that, to some extent, there are some serious communication lapses in the dialogue between Russia and NATO, and we've seen that in the NATO-Russia Council meetings and recent developments between the two. So I was just wondering to what extent this might, be moved forward in some way. Thank you.
Our problem is not a lack of communication. Our problem is that we don't agree on values, and increasingly we don't even agree on interests.
Fundamentals, yeah.
And you know, ask Chancellor Merkel whether she wants to spend more time with Putin than she already has. She has devoted more time than anyone should be forced to. I hope John Kerry doesn't go to Moscow or Sochi anymore. He looks pathetic. We look like we need this relationship with the Kremlin more than they need us. President Obama, in his State of the Union speech in January 2015, bragged about how the United States was leading the isolation of Russia. 4 months later, his Secretary of State flew to Sochi and was effusive in his praise for Putin, who kept him waiting 4 hours, by the way, for meeting with him. And has been to Moscow, I think, 3 more times. He's on the phone or meeting with Lavrov almost on a daily basis. Why anyone would want to spend any time with the Russian foreign minister is beyond me. They lie. They refuse to acknowledge the truth. They say they're not in Ukraine. They refuse to acknowledge responsibility for hitting the humanitarian convoy in Syria. Frankly, I don't see the point of much more dialogue with Russia. It leads nowhere, and we look pathetic and weak. So I understand we have to talk to them, but we have to do it much more on our terms rather than on Putin's terms.
So what is to be done if you don't want to talk to the Russians anymore, which might be the solution, you know, to, how to say, to generate more confidence to these countries located in the close proximity of Russia? If the dialogue is not a solution, not increasing NATO presence in the area is not a solution, which is the solution?
It seems to me we need a containment policy, which does sound like Cold War, and I don't mean to get into a discussion about is this a new Cold War. I find that kind of discussion rather useless and distracting. But containment of Russian aggression, pushback, a ramping up of sanctions. We're having the wrong debate about sanctions. The debate we should be is what price will Russia continue to pay Putin, let me be clear, because I don't want to conflate Russia and Putin, particularly to someone like Andrei, whom I greatly respect. But the Putin regime, how do we sanction the Putin regime more for its defiance of the Minsk agreement, which I would also argue we should blow up. It's not working. How do we deal with the buzzing of NATO aircraft and planes, ships? Frankly, I think what the Turks did, no one liked it, but I think should have been recognized as the right thing to do last November. And I don't want to go to war with Russia, don't get me wrong, but I think if we warned of the next Russian plane that buzzes a NATO aircraft or ship, and then if they continue to do it, if we shot it down, I bet you that would be the last time they did that. Putin, at the end of the day, does not want a confrontation with NATO, but in particular with the United States. And if we showed a little more resolve and strength, I think he would be forced to back down. We've talked about finding off-ramps for Putin on Ukraine. He's not been interested in off-ramps. So in that situation, it seems to me taking a much tougher line. Again, it's easier for the United States to talk about that than it is for countries in this region. But countries in this region are going to face the brunt of further Russian aggression sooner than the United States will. So to me, it's time that we wake up to what I would argue is the greatest existential threat to all of us, and that is the Putin regime. It's not Russia, it is the Putin regime. And the modernization of the military, the muscle flexing. I mean, what they're doing in Syria, as Andrei said, should be unacceptable. And frankly, the last thing I'll say, and I promise I'll shut up, we shouldn't use the word unacceptable if we're going to accept it. If we say something's unacceptable, there have to be consequences. And if there aren't consequences, then we essentially are giving Putin a green light to continue to engage in this kind of behavior.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I was going to ask you, has anyone got can anyone see any glimmers of hope for the next year, or is there anything to be optimistic about? Can you see anything? No?
Tunisia.
No? Anyone? Sorry?
Tunisia.
Okay, great. Well, that's one thing. Great. Anything else? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed. And,